Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's briefing, Two Sides of the Same Coin, an ACLU Forum on Racial and Economic Justice. A few quick housekeeping items. To ask a question, please use the Q&A panel available at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to address them during the Q&A portion later in the call. Please note that closed captioning is available. To activate, simply select the closed caption button found at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitle. I will now hand it over to ReNika Moore, Director of the Racial Justice Program.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Leadership Forum. I'm ReNika Moore. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of the Racial Justice Program at the ACLU. Today, we're going to be exploring the intersection of racial and economic justice. And that's because we know there's no racial equality without economic equality. So we want to talk about, in America right now, there is a 9-to-1 racial wealth gap, and that's between Black and white families. And the ACLU, along with all of you, our closest partners, can play a key role in taking that gap from 90 to 0. So before diving into our conversation today, I want to start with saying thank you. You represent the ACLU's top supporters, and that's across the nation. Second, I want to note that this is an off-the-record conversation. So if we have any journalists joining us today, nothing we say is available for attribution or for citation. We want to make sure that all of our guests joining us today feel like this is an intimate forum and that this is a safe space to raise your questions. So we've very purposefully assembled this particular group of leadership supporters for a new and exclusive kind of forum. We want to use this opportunity in this leadership forum in two different ways. We want to be able to talk about our longer term priorities and to give you an inside look. And we also want to create a more intimate forum to hear directly from you, to hear your early feedback, and to hear any questions that you have about the work. We realize that we may have a lot of questions, and so if we don't get to your question, we will provide opportunities for how we can follow up with you. So we wanted to start this series by focusing on economic and racial justice because there are a lot of factors at play. We know that there is now a national reckoning around race, that we have a new presidential administration that is more supportive of civil liberties and civil rights. And this is our opportunity to push for a more affirmative, rights-building racial justice agenda. We're calling that agenda the Systemic Equality Agenda, and we want to talk about that with you today. So this is how we're hoping to structure today's conversation. We're going to talk about the social and political context and landscape that we're working in, what's possible, and where we need to push for reform collectively. We're going to be sharing concrete strategies to close the racial wealth gap. We'll be talking about student debt cancellation. We'll be talking about fair housing and postal banking. So we want to create a robust space for conversation at the end so that we can field your thoughts, your questions, and one of my colleagues will be monitoring the Q&A. So please feel free to drop your questions in throughout the webinar, and we'll be providing instructions on how to do that. So at this point, I'd like to invite my colleagues to turn on their videos and join me. Thanks, everyone. So again, as the director of the ACLU's Racial Justice Program, I work on policy reform, I work on strategic litigation and advocacy campaigns that address racial inequality and bias in our criminal legal system, challenging educational inequities, and of course, today's topic, furthering economic justice. Of course, that monumental task of fighting for racist policies and practices that are rooted in white supremacy and that perpetuate racial inequality don't sit only with me and my team. Racial justice is an organization-wide priority, and imperative, and as I don't have to tell this group, intersects every single civil liberties issue. And so every piece of advocacy in the courts, in the legislature, and on the streets, raises this and it prioritizes racial justice. So by way of introduction, let's go around and introduce my colleagues. And so I'm gonna ask that you please share your name, your pronouns, and where you sit within the ACLU network. So I'll start with Rakim.
Great, thanks, ReNika. My name is Rakim Brooks. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm a senior campaign strategist within the National Political Advocacy Division, alongside ReNika Moore, co-leading our systemic equality campaign.
And I'll turn it over to Ria.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name is Ria Tabacoo Mar. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of the ACLU's National Women's Rights Project, which is a project within the National Legal Department based in New York.
And Eve.
Hi everyone, I'm Eve Garrow. I use pronouns she and her. I'm a senior policy analyst and advocate for our Dignity for All project at the Southern California affiliate in California, and that is housed in our Economic Justice project.
Great. So I'm going to ask you all to stick around, and I'm going to have some questions for each of you. So the first question is for Rakim. Today we're zeroing in on efforts to close the racial wealth gap. Can you quickly outline the ACLU's systemic equality agenda and how economic justice policy fits into that agenda?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So again, it's good to be with everyone. Rakim Brooks. Our systemic equality agenda falls into 4 buckets. Some of it is traditional work with which you all are familiar and have been supporting for some time, and some of it is new. The first pieces of that work are what we would call our empowerment agenda. That's our traditional voting rights and reconciliation work. And we're proud to say that since we launched the agenda, the Biden administration has already begun to implement some measures of an executive order that we suggested, which included providing those people that were incarcerated but living in states that would allow them to vote, providing them with processes so that they can vote in the 2022 elections. Secondly, we have what's called our reconciliation bucket, and that involves our traditional work or relatively new work around HR 40. And I'm sure you all have been tracking that, but for those who haven't, that is the bill to create a commission to study reparations for Black Americans in Congress that recently passed out of the House for the first time in history. In addition to those, we've been working on access issues under broadband and fair housing. We'll be talking about fair housing later. We've published blogs on all of these things in case you want a deeper dive, but those are 2 issues that we're focused on in terms of access. And finally, we're focused on prosperity, and that's where the racial wealth gap work really fits. We're focused on 3 issues right now: the student debt crisis, forgiving $50,000 worth of student debt in order to close the racial wealth gap; postal banking, which really is about access to essential financial services. 50% of Black Americans lack access to the basic financial services they need to lead their lives because banks are fleeing Black neighborhoods at a dramatic rate that leaves them prey to predatory lenders. And finally, we're working on the child tax credit, which has been all over the news recently, was pushed in the president's recent address to Congress. And there we're seeking for a permanent extension of the enhanced tax credit. So those are the 3 issues we're working on. We're going to discuss 2 of them tonight. And we're very happy to say that we're working in partnership with so many different organizations to achieve those goals. Those, for example, Americans for Financial Reform, Color of Change, the NAACP, Center for Responsible Lending, Student Debt Crisis, and the Student Borrower Protection Center, among many, many others. To close these structural gaps in wealth between Black and white households, we're going to need collective action from all players in our economy, from corporations to nonprofits, to everyone who's just concerned about justice and fulfilling the American dream. One of the reasons we launched this particular piece of the initiative is because we know that the American dream costs more for Black Americans and for Indigenous Americans, for Latinx Americans. And so, as I said, we're partnering with as many groups as we can, and recently announced that we're partnering in the 90 to 1 initiative led by the Robin Hood Foundation with Goldman Sachs, the Children's Defense Fund, Starbucks, and many, many others. And as I said, we've been working in collaboration with many of those groups, including publishing an op-ed with the Children's Defense Fund on the child tax credit. Thanks, Makiba, for dropping that in the chat. So throughout, we want to focus tonight on the ways in which the ACLU has a unique role to play. I'll let you know that in particular on these prosperity issues, our colleagues and collaborators are excited to have us. I was told today on a call about student debt that they've been waiting for someone like the ACLU to show up because of the resources that we can bring to bear because of all of you. And so those are the issues that I wanted to raise with you on a structure for our conversation of what the systemic equality agenda is about.
Great, thanks, Rakim. And so we'll be talking about each of those in turn. But I do want to talk about what's happening at the local and state level. So Rakim talked about sort of what's happening at the federal level. And I'd like to turn to you, Eve, and to hear sort of how you can describe whether you felt a shift as you push for local and statewide change in California compared to what we've seen at the federal level.
Well, thank you. And again, it's great to be here. So my work focuses on advancing housing justice in California and fighting against policies that criminalize folks who are unhoused, who are displaced from their housing. What I like to say is that California is really the epicenter of housing displacement. I say that because we have about 12% of the nation's population, but over 50% of the nation's population of people who are displaced from their housing and living in places not fit for human habitation. But despite the magnitude of this crisis in California, I'm sorry to report that we've only seen modest and inadequate investments in affordable housing, which is, obviously the solution for people who are displaced from their housing because it's unaffordable. Instead, at the local level, we've often seen a doubling down on strategies that make it a crime to be unhoused. And that has really reached a fevered pitch in California. And I want to be clear, these issues around housing precarity and displacement from housing are a byproduct of institutional and structural racism. And not surprisingly, people of color are disproportionately impacted. So Black people represent around 6.5% of California's population, but 40% of our unhoused population. And once displaced, they're subjected to systematic violence at the hands of police. So local law enforcement officers harass, cite, and jail people for living in public when they literally have nowhere else to live, which is really just a cynical attempt to displace and segregate and disappear people who have already been displaced from their housing. So while the crisis is a byproduct of structural racism, our municipal responses in California, and I think this is common across the nation, have been a form of racial violence and class warfare, which is one of the reasons we're mounting a campaign in California to pass legislation at the state level that would prohibit discrimination against unhoused people based on their housing status, in addition to our work advancing investments in affordable housing and tenant protections.
Got it. Thanks, Eve. So I think, we may get the question of, is this the ACLU turning to economic justice issues? And so I want to put this question to you, Ria. Is the ACLU now stepping into the economic justice space? And if so, would you answer that question of sort of, is this the first time the ACLU is kind of taking on economic justice issues?
I think the ACLU has a really long and rich history in the economic justice space, but I can only speak for the Women's Rights Project. And I will say, many folks may know that the Women's Rights Project was founded by Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 1972. And what people often don't know about Justice Ginsburg and her leadership of the Women's Rights Project is how focused she was on intersectional issues, on issues affecting Black women, on issues affecting low-income women. One of my favorite cases that she ever filed was a challenge to North Carolina's program of forcibly sterilizing Black women who were on North Carolina's public assistance program in the early 1970s, not well known. She also authored a brief making connections between the use of the death penalty and perpetuation of white supremacy. Something that was, it reads like a radical brief today. And of course, it was actually filed in the 1970s. So truly groundbreaking stuff from Justice Ginsburg. And we've continued that thread through our work today, the Women's Rights Project, to name just one example. We currently have a campaign challenging the culture of rampant sexual harassment at McDonald's franchise restaurants. These are workers who are overwhelmingly low income, disproportionately women of color, and who are subjected to sexual harassment at franchise restaurants, and McDonald's claims no corporate responsibility for it. So I see that very much as the legacy of the work that Justice Ginsburg seeded in the 70s when she thought about women who are at the intersection of these identities and who were sort of most in need of making America's promise a reality.
Thanks, Ria, and thanks for setting the stage for all of you. I'm going to ask Rakim to stick around as we dive in. And so we're going to talk about student debt cancellation. So I like the idea of starting with student debt cancellation for a couple of reasons. One, it's an issue that can be solved by the executive branch if we apply the right pressure and make the case. And it's an issue that many can relate to. We know we've heard a lot from students and folks holding student loan debt within the ACLU's own staff. But really, this is for a lot of Americans. They understand that college is an essential component to getting a job, to accumulating wealth, and that loans are a necessary support for accessing higher education. Yet at the same time, there really isn't enough attention paid to the inequities in the system of debt in the US and how it's contributing to the widening racial wealth gap. So let's sort of start by naming the problem and the scale of the problem, really. Without factoring in race, how big is the student debt crisis in the US at large? And then I'd like you to talk about how does it affect Black Americans specifically.
Sure, thanks, ReNika. I think it is important to just start to talk about the scale of the crisis as a whole. Makiba, would you mind sharing a stat on the screen that I think will be alarming to some, though? So over 44 million Americans are collectively carrying more than 1.5. I actually will adjust that stat. We know it now to be over 1.6 trillion, that's not billion, that's $1 trillion of student debt, with the average student loan balance after 4 years being roughly $30,000 a year. It's hard really to appreciate just how dramatic this change this is in our society as compared with previous iterations and previous generations. But just to give you some sense, when we've been hosting our action series, which is where we pull our people power activists, typically, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people come to learn about an issue. We had a number of people who had graduated in the 1960s and 70s say that they had graduated with roughly $5,000 to $10,000 worth of debt, and they thought that was a lot at the time. But of course, it's grown exponentially since then, largely because states and the federal government have shifted responsibility for higher education onto families, but that was not always the case. I want to put this in context for what it means for Black families in particular, given that that's what we come to talk about tonight. Makiba, would you happen to share that next slide? Thank you again. So no group of Americans are as burdened by student debt. When I said the American dream costs Black Americans more, I really did mean it. And I mean it in particularly if education is the way to achieve the American dream, then Black Americans are disproportionately disadvantaged by our current educational system. 31% of Black families hold student debt compared to 20% of white families. There's a stat that's not on this slide that I'd like to share with you, which is Black students for the same degree, for the exact same degree, according to studies, pay $1.50 for every dollar that a white student pays. And largely that's because of the ability of those white families and white students to leverage familial wealth and financial resources so that they don't have to take on additional debt. 4 years after graduation, that the distance between a Black borrower and a white borrower triples to about $25,000. What that means, sort of using my other stat, is that Black borrowers 4 years after graduating have paid roughly $250 for their degree, while white borrowers have paid roughly $1. And the thing that really is shocking to all of us, and was shocking to me even when I began to do this research, was that 20 years after starting school, on average, Black borrowers still owe 95% of their debt, while white borrowers owe only 6% of their debt. And just to contextualize how this problem came together for people who are new to the issue, you have to understand that predominantly wealth in this country has been built through housing. And this isn't the session to talk about that, but I'm sure many of you know that Black Americans have been systemically denied access to housing wealth. And as a result, when we moved to a system that required families to self-finance for education, we were requiring Black families to do the self-financing without the resources that had already been accumulated throughout the 20th century. And this is the result. There's a third piece of this problem that I'd like to highlight, which was also new to me as I was doing the research, but is actually something I've lived out in my own experience, which is that Black Americans enter the job market, enter a discriminatory job market that often causes them to upskill or to acquire additional debt through additional degrees in order to deal with that discrimination. So you've probably seen the stats that say, you know, a Black high school graduate is less likely to get a job than a white person who has not graduated high school. That same thing plays itself out up the ladder, so that college-educated Black Americans often seek additional graduate education specifically so that they can combat that and thereby acquire more debt, which they are unable to pay off 20 years after they've started their undergraduate education. ReNika may be having
sorry, having some technical, yeah, I'm sorry, I had some technical difficulties with the mute. So thanks for laying out the problem. I wanted to turn next to sort of what is the ACLU's proposed solution to this problem? And then can you tell us, well, actually, if you can tell us what the proposed solution is, and then I wanted to ask about the Biden administration, where they stand.
Absolutely. So what we have done is come together with a large-scale coalition of other actors to ask for $50,000 of student debt forgiveness for every eligible borrower. We're only targeting public loans because under the Higher Education Act, the president is empowered to forgive that debt instantly. And that's why, for example, the president was able to go ahead and suspend student debt payments and interest payments until September 30th of this year. So we'd like for him to use that same power to forgive $50,000 worth of student debt, because we believe that that will lead to a more level playing field. In particular, our own research suggests that that alone will reduce the racial wealth gap by 22% for between Black and white Americans. So much of what we talked about at the beginning, the 9-to-1, could be done away with if we just removed the student debt, if we dealt with the student debt crisis.
Got it. And then can you tell us sort of where the administration stands on this at this point?
Yeah, sure. So the president during the campaign, some might remember, agreed that there was a student debt crisis and agreed that $10,000, at least $10,000 of student debt forgiveness would be appropriate. We have obviously pushed for more, $50,000, as I said, and in fact have been advocating virulently that $10,000 would not be enough, in part because it would expand the racial wealth gap. I myself have written an article describing my own experience responding to the president's notion that Ivy League graduates perhaps did not need to be included in student debt forgiveness. Makiba might share that link for you all. Thanks a lot, Makiba. And so where we are now is that the Biden administration is presently determining what it thinks its authorities are under the Higher Education Act. As I said, that research has already been done by a law clinic at Harvard, and it's been advertised by Senator Schumer and Senators Warren, who are now leading the charge, an effort to, bicameral effort to forgive student debt. And they say that they're in the process, they being the Biden administration, are in the process of assessing it. Our hope is that they come out on the right side, closer to $50,000. I think they've moved away from 10, recognizing that that would expand the racial wealth gap.
Great. And so can you tell us sort of what you and your team are in conversation with the Biden administration, and what you see as other actors who might carry influence and might be able to move the needle here?
Yeah, absolutely. So colleges and universities can move the needle here. We should all be in touch with our institutions, our alma maters, and express to them just how upset we are about the levels of debt that students are carrying. Not every person is going to, Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, where if you're a low income, you come from a low income family, you might be able to graduate debt free. There are plenty of colleges and universities where that is not the case, and people are graduating with gargantuan sums. So that's one place to go. Another place would be the halls of Congress. Obviously, as I said, there are members of Congress who are leading this effort. Among them, Senators Warren and Schumer, Congress members Presley and Mondaire Jones, for instance, and many others. But there are so many congressional members who are not yet on board with this agenda. And we need to make clear to them that this isn't an either or in terms of choosing this sort of debt forgiveness versus other forms of debt forgiveness. As I was trying to explain at the beginning, this is a unique area of American law where we're allowed to forgive this debt. It's already debt that's been taken out. It doesn't actually add to the federal deficit. And so we should think about it singularly off onto its own as a policy issue. And then we should come back and deal with those individuals who are burdened by private loan debt, for instance. And we should also come back and deal with the cost of affordability and affordability of higher education. But those issues can be taken apart from this particular issue.
Thanks, Rakim, for laying this out to us. We want to make sure we get through everything. So thank you, Rakim. Again, I'm going to ask Ria and Eve to join us as we pivot to fair housing. Thanks, folks. So I'm just going to jump right in. We know housing is a major issue for Black people in the U.S. And that a major source of financial instability and inequity, and that's only been exacerbated through the pandemic. So building housing and economic security is a critical first step, right, in our path to building systemic equality. So my first question is for Ria. What's the correlation between the housing crisis, racial justice, and economic justice?
Well, that's a great question. And one simple way of answering it is to look at the average person who is evicted. The average person who is evicted is a 49-year-old Black woman. That is who is at the epicenter of this crisis. And when you see the stats that are coming up, gosh, that first statistic is just staggering. 30 million in the US alone at risk of eviction. You know, in a typical year, there are about 2 million Americans at risk of eviction. So that just shows you how the pandemic has exacerbated this crisis. But Black women were always at the heart of it. So in 17 of 36 states that our data and analytics team was able to get the data and analyze, we learned that Black women renters had evictions filed against them at double or higher the rate of white renters. And that evictions filed against them is really key, because these are not necessarily people who were the most behind on rent, or who ultimately the landlords were entitled to evict. Some of this is also targeting by landlords of who they think might be afraid of an eviction filing, who might be in a position where they're not able to fight an eviction filing. And so we see Black women targeted. And once they have been filed against, that can follow them and their family for many years.
Great. And I've heard, this question is for Eve. I've heard you talk about survivors of housing insecurity and how that affects and plugs into what Ria was saying. So can you explain sort of what you mean when you talk about survivors?
Sure. I mean, I think for me, there's two ways to think about it. First, everyone who's displaced from their housing or housing insecure is a survivor of an unjust, unequal, and violent system that harms them, although the popular and dominant discourse tends to be around blaming and shaming people, right, who are living on the streets.
Right.
And policy decisions during the Reagan administration to gut affordable housing programs that really resulted, we've never recovered from that, and that has really resulted in the crisis that we see today, causes real harm to people by preventing them from meeting their needs, their basic needs for things like housing, water, and sanitation that everybody needs to stay alive. So in a sense, this is a form of violence that that people, really are survivors of. obviously the criminalization of people who are unhoused is a form of violence that people must withstand and survive. So our report on the criminalization of banishment of people in Lancaster, which is a city in Los Angeles County in the Mojave Desert, found that unhoused people, and I think we have a stat on this on the slide, represent only 1% of the population in the city, but a full 25% of police stops, resulting in misdemeanor citations. And these citations are mostly for being unhoused in public, and they disproportionately target Black people. We found that law enforcement displaces encampments when people have nowhere to go, pushing them deep into remote areas, far into the Mojave Desert, where people are separated from just basic resources like water. In other places, they coerce people into mass shelters by threat of citation and jail time, which forcibly segregates them in institutional settings that are often unsanitary and downright abusive, as my research and that of others has shown. And again, these strategies are meant to discipline and disappear people living on the street, people who are disproportionately Black. The other way I think about survivors is that actual survivors of domestic violence, which is the way we usually think of the word, are really a large part of our unhoused community. So in Orange County, where my office is, 40% of unhoused women identify as survivors of DV. And their voices, I've come to appreciate more and more, really need to be part of the conversation. This is part of that intersectional work that we have to do. The women I work with describe taking the courageous step to leave abusive relationships only to get ensnared in a homeless services system that is impossible for them to step out of, and that often subjects them to more violence. So the streets expose them to violence, and homeless shelters, as I said, which are often the only alternative for them, replicate the forms of abuse they experience in the relationships that they fled. So they're constantly surveilled, they're controlled, they can't leave by foot. Staff use their power advantage sometimes to sexually harass and assault them, and often with impunity, which is one of the reasons we have a lawsuit right now in Orange County. So from our perspective, housing justice is gender and survivor justice because it gives survivors a viable alternative to abusive relationships and systems, and this gives them power. The women I work with, I just want to say finally, have channeled their experiences into political action for housing justice, including state level lobbying. And this is just, for me, it's been a really inspiring and transformational thing to be a part of and to witness.
Thanks, Eve. And so you've talked about centering how we bring impacted communities into the conversation. And I want to bring Ria back into this. Obviously, one of the many tools that the ACLU uses is litigation. And so I'd love for you to talk about your litigation in Kansas City, Missouri, and the client activist at the center of that fight.
Thanks, ReNika. Yes, litigation is very much at the center of our toolbox in the Women's Rights Project. And I just wanted to take a step back for a moment. I'm so glad that Eve mentioned gender-based violence as a contributor to the housing crisis, because that actually was the entry point for the Women's Rights Project into housing as a gender justice issue. So some decades ago, we filed our first case challenging what's called a nuisance ordinance. These are laws that allow and sometimes require landlords to evict people who've had a certain number of contacts with the police. And what we learned is that very often renters were having contacts with the police because they were calling 911 as a result of being the victims of gender-based violence. And once they had made those calls a certain number of times, regardless of their culpability or how those calls were ultimately resolved, they themselves were then considered to be the nuisance. And so we had launched a campaign that we called I Am Not a Nuisance, on behalf of survivors challenging those ordinances. And that was really the way in for the Women's Rights Project into housing as a gender justice issue. We realized it was not just survivors who were facing these disproportionate rates of eviction filings, but really, Black women, survivors and not survivors. The Kansas City case, I think, is really a terrific example of the ACLU at its finest. This is a community in Missouri that has been organizing for a long time around issues including housing affordability, housing segregation, other sort of core housing issues. And when the pandemic started, evictions sort of flew to the top of their to-do list. And as many folks know, the CDC issued an evictions moratorium. And what our clients were seeing, we represent a community organizing group called KC Tenants for Kansas City. What KC Tenants was seeing is that thousands of evictions were still being filed against their members despite the CDC moratorium. And they thought, doesn't the CDC moratorium mean you can't do this? And so we went into court on their behalf, challenging the way that Missouri courts have been interpreting the CDC moratorium. And, I have, spoiler alert, I have to say, we have not been successful so far. So this is a real battle we are fighting on all fronts. So our judge found that his interpretation of the CDC moratorium was just, you can't evict someone, you can't physically remove them from their home, but you can do everything short of that consistent with the CDC moratorium. And I think that's just, I think that's a wrong interpretation of the moratorium if you read it, but it's also just as in practical terms, right? It makes that moratorium meaningless because we know that 33% of renters, when they get an eviction notice, will just leave. They don't know that they have a right to fight it. They feel they can't fight it. They can't afford a lawyer. They will just up and go. So once that has been filed against you, it's kind of meaningless for many people whether the process will be completed. We also know that 86% of landlords are represented in eviction proceedings, but only 2% of renters, which is not at all surprising when you consider there's no right to an attorney in most places in evictions context. And these are people by definition who typically have had difficulty meeting rent and other basic needs, so they don't have extra funds for an attorney. We're appealing that decision, and we're also fighting the evictions crisis in a number of other fronts that I'll mention very briefly. One is that our case is not the only case. We tried to enforce the CDC moratorium. We've seen landlords in a variety of states actually challenge the CDC moratorium. And you may have seen in the news yesterday, yet another judge has now found the CDC moratorium actually exceeded the CDC's powers. We've seen 4 judges around the country do that so far, all of them appointed by Trump. We've seen several Democrat-appointed judges uphold the moratorium. So we are watching those cases as they go up on appeal, and we are fighting for the right of the government to actually take these kind of remedial steps, which, as we've seen, are not enough, but certainly they're a necessary, if not sufficient, step. We're also fighting for the right to counsel in evictions. So we know that the right to counsel can dramatically affect the outcome of an eviction proceeding. We were part of a successful campaign in Boulder, Colorado last year, which we're very excited about, bringing the right to counsel to tenants in Boulder. And we are now in partnership with the ACLU of Delaware, engaged in a campaign in Delaware. Again, when you think about the fact that 86% of landlords are represented and only 2% of tenants, this is a real opportunity where we can disrupt evictions. We can actually dissuade landlords from filing those evictions in the first place when they know they're actually going to be held to the law and going to have to show it, not just say it. We can even decrease eviction filings at the outset. So this is a war we are fighting on all fronts.
Thanks, Ria. I'll also lift up that at the federal level, we're also asking for Congress to act to provide billions in emergency rental assistance and providing funding support to cities and states to implement the right to counsel in eviction proceedings. So taking this and recognizing the role of the federal government in addressing this problem. So I want to turn back to Eve. And Eve, if you could talk to us about, part of what the ACLU does is use all the tools in its toolbox. So we just heard about litigation. Can you talk about the advocacy space where you principally work, and as part of your Dignity for All initiative, is the right to housing. And can you explain sort of what the affirmative right looks like briefly, because we want to make sure we leave some time for questions, but can you talk about why it's your North Star in the fight for fair housing?
Sure, of course. And thank you for asking that question, because we're actually doing a lot of narrative changing work to try to like normalize this idea, because it's very unfamiliar to people in the United States, since we really don't have a right to housing. So what it would look like is a housing subsidy that's available to everybody who needs it as an immediate response to their crisis. Not something that you have to wait like 10, 20 years on a list, right? On a waiting list to get. It would require appropriations at the federal level that expand with need. And we don't have that right now. So actually what we have is a fairly good, housing subsidy program for low income folks. Sometimes it's housing choice vouchers, sometimes it's public housing, but appropriations are capped, and it only reaches about 1 out of every 4 households that are eligible. On the other hand, we actually do have housing subsidies that act like a right, where appropriations do expand with need, but they're for higher income people. So one example is the mortgage interest deduction. So for the US spends more for the mortgage interest rate deduction than for affordable housing for low income people. And that deduction, as everybody knows who takes it, is immediately available to anyone who owns a home or real estate. You don't have to wait 10 or 20 years to get it. You qualify, you get it. So these are not new ideas. They're just not channeled to the people who need them the most. And I just want to sort of wrap that up by saying that these developments are really not an accident. They're part of the machinery of structural racism. So subsidized affordable housing, or so-called Section 8, became a dog whistle during the 1980s for a program that was viewed as disproportionately benefiting Black people, and particularly Black women, Black mothers. And white supremacist ideology was used to justify almost completely abolishing it. And at the same time, the extremely generous programs like the mortgage rate interest deduction that act like a right are, of course, disproportionately channeled to white people due to the racial gap in home and property ownership. We call it the North Star because I believe it's the true solution to housing displacement. It is aspirational, but it is achievable if enough people can visualize how transformative it would be.
Thank you, Eve. Ria, I want to thank you as well. We're going to pivot now to postal banking. So thank you. So I'm going to ask Rakim to come back in. And we're going to shorten this section a bit so we can leave some time for questions. But I do want to just kind of frame this issue. We know that bank branches are closing at an accelerating rate, and we can expect the number of unbanked Americans to grow, particularly Black Americans. And we know that the fees they pay and that Black consumers, like other low-income consumers, generally are prime candidates to be exploited. We know that's true based on the payday loan industry, and that the ACLU has an interesting solution for that. Postal banking, which played a huge part, post offices played a huge part in last year's election. So, so we want to hear, how can postal banking be a solution to this problem? And what are we doing to address this?
Sure, I'm going to speed through this section so we can get to questions. Nearly everybody on the call is a lawyer, so we're wordy and we apologize for that. Makiva, would you mind sharing the slide on postal banking? And I'll just talk from that and I'll talk about the solution as well. So here's what our audiences really need to know. That, as ReNika said, traditional bank branches are closing across the United States. It's not unique to Black communities, but it is disproportionately happening in Black and low-income communities. The effect of bank closures are pretty obvious. Ultimately, payday lenders, check cashing places, and other what we would call subprime financial alternatives move into those neighborhoods. and they end up costing families somewhere on the order. It's actually more than $2,400 based on the recent statistics, just very recent. So actually there's a reason that this slide is incorrect. But we're basically talking about 10% of low-income Americans' income each year being spent on subprime financial services. And there's a simple solution to that: the post office. The post office right now, today, is currently authorized to provide check cashing services, to provide money transfers, to provide online bill pay, and a number of other things that we think would be promising. For example, low-cost ATMs and prepaid debit cards, all of which could help us deal with this financial crisis that low-income communities are facing, particularly low-income Black communities. And the reason that this is a racial justice issue and a civil liberties issue is because banks are publicly chartered. They have public responsibilities to these communities, and they are evading them, particularly their responsibilities under the Community Reinvestment Act, which says if you place a depository institution in a neighborhood, you have an obligation to lend to that neighborhood. Historically, many banks would borrow from those communities, that is, to take in deposits, spend them in other places, enriching themselves and others, and not enriching the community from which they came. So the Community Reinvestment Act was passed. And banks have been evading that and just closing depository institutions. So we need to meet that crisis with a public response, and we can do so through the post office. In case you're curious, there's a lot going on right now. There are Postal Board of Governor nominations that are proceeding to the Senate floor, and we need to make sure that those are successful so that the Postal Board of Governors has reached full capacity and can govern effectively alongside Postmaster General DeJoy, or choose to remove him if they so decide. And simultaneously, there is an appropriations language moving through the House, sponsored by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Pascrell, and Marcy Kaptur, that would ask for postal banking pilots throughout the country. And so there are a number of congressional members who signed on to that. There's a companion in the Senate that's also moving. So we need for senators and members of Congress to support that appropriations language. We can talk more about it in the Q&A, hopefully, but I want to give a fully comprehensive view.
Thanks for giving us the quick rundown of a complicated issue, Rakim. I'm going to invite Ria and Eve back for the group discussion. And so we've heard a lot about a number of different issues, and now we'd love to hear from you, our supporters. We want to hear your thoughts, your questions, your hopes for closing the racial wealth gap. So we're going to take several questions at a time, and I will moderate and direct them to my colleagues. And so I'm going to ask Nakiba to provide some instructions on how to join the conversation.
If you would like to ask your question, please use the Q&A panel found at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer them. ReNika, I have a few questions lined up for you so far. One is from James B. If the president can only forgive public student debt, what proportion of the 1.6 trillion student debt is from public loans? And another question that we had come in was, how does the shifting courts factor into your litigation strategies? Is rights building possible under a more conservative judiciary? And then another question that we had was, how would housing policies at the local and state level affect policy at the federal level?
Great, so we'll try to get through these quickly. But Rakim, I'll direct the first question to you about how does the debt cancellation affect student loans given the public universities?
Yeah, is it given public universities, or was it just
I'm sorry.
I thought it was,
Nakiba, can you read the question again?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought it was how much of it is publicly held. Is that right?
Sure. So if the president can only forgive public student debt, what portion of the 1.6 trillion student debt is from public loans?
Yeah, 2/3. So historically, you might know that, I'll try to do this quickly. Historically, the federal government basically served as a guarantor on student debt. So a private actor provided the student loan, and then the federal government would back them up. After the 2008 financial crisis, the entire system was reworked. And so now the federal government is a primary holder of student debt in a majority of cases. And so I believe it's over $1 trillion for sure, but it may be approaching 1.2 now.
Thanks, Rakim. So Ria, would you like to weigh in on the question of facing more conservative courts? How do we push for a rights building agenda given the judiciary that we have?
It's a great question, ReNika, and I guess I have a couple of answers. One is, obviously we've all been following the rightward shift of the courts, but the reality is that many of the courts, and particularly the Supreme Court, have long not been with the ACLU on most of our issues. So we've had some really high-profile victories in some areas, like including LGBT rights, where I spent many years, but the courts have actually long been hostile to many ACLU issue areas, and we have persisted for the last 100 years in moving rights forward. So, this court won't stop us. There's also just a more practical answer, which is, the court is conservative on some issues, but not necessarily others. And so the question is, right, where can we find those openings where, our rights building agenda actually can align with a more conservative theory of judicial interpretation? And I think our victory last year in Bostock versus Clayton County, the decision where the US Supreme Court recognized that it's illegal to fire someone simply for being LGBTQ is a great example of that. This is a case in which we were enforcing Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the reality is that Title VII, which bars workplace discrimination, like many civil rights statutes, actually has very broad language. And this is a court that has told us that they want to give statutes their true effect. Well, Congress has passed some very expansive civil rights laws, not all of the laws that we need, but there are some very expansive civil rights laws. And where are there opportunities for us, like the one we saw in Bostock, to really take advantage of statutes that are on our side and that really should be interpreted in a broad way that could really give rise to a more expansive vision of equality than we've had to date.
Thanks, Ria. We're going to try to get one more batch of questions to answer before we go. So Makiba, do you have more questions for us?
Yes, we have a question from Peter G. There is an unavoidable equity issue with debt forgiveness. Those who scrimped and worked 2 jobs to pay off most of their debt gets no benefit for quote unquote forgiveness of debt they already paid off, even as those who could not pay off debt are helped. How do we resolve this? And then we have another question from Henry A. What is the ACLU's view on the inclusion of healthcare reform, specifically Medicare for all, as an integral element of the program for racial and economic justice? And then finally, from Paula W., how would the mortgage interest deduction / affordable housing rebalance happen?
So why don't we, Rakim, do you want to take the first question in terms of
I'm happy to.
Student debt balance? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a powerful challenge to the work that we're doing, but I don't think an insurmountable one. I take the question in good faith. And so I take the answer to be the same as the answer that we confront in the child tax care credit context, which is to say there are people who have raised their children who did not have the benefit of a government subsidy. And now we're talking about providing families with $3,600 or $3,000. The question is about the benefit to the individual in the case and overall societal benefit. And the overall societal benefit is both economic, but it also redresses a history of inequality, particularly among Black households. And so my answer, I guess, is the same, which is I wouldn't deprive children today of a $3,000 or $3,600 tax credit because I didn't receive one, for instance. And I think it's quite the same in the case of the student debt relief.
Thanks, Rakim. So let's see, Eve, do you think it makes sense for you to talk about the mortgage deduction and sort of how that fits into our housing work and the right to housing?
Sure, and I think it's a good question because I think most people don't really appreciate that the lion's share of the subsidies, the tax breaks for the mortgage interest rate deduction actually go to, our wealthiest people, like big corporate landlords who have really been part of the problem in raising rents and, already profiting off of poor people. So if we had like a legislative fix where we reduced, you know, that benefit for the wealthiest, you know, beneficiaries, and we invested that in affordable housing, it would be truly redistributive. I mean, I use the example because it's a great example of, you know, something acting like a right for wealthy people versus something that obviously does not act like a right at all, right, for people who need it the most. And there's other ways, obviously, that we could finance investments in permanent subsidized affordable housing for folks, but I think that's a very good question.
Thanks, Eve. So I am mindful of time as we're at time, and so I want to thank all of my colleagues and everyone who made this webinar possible, and I really want to thank again our supporters because we couldn't do this without you. We will certainly follow up with any questions we weren't able to address in our Q&A. And so if you weren't able to get your questions answered, I just want to note that the email has been dropped in the chat. You please feel free to email us at leadershipforum@aclu.org. And so again, thank you for being a part of this first webinar about closing the racial wealth gap. And we're working together to ensure that we the people really does mean all of us. So thank you again.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's Economic Justice Leadership Forum. If you have questions that we were unable to answer, please email us at leadershipforum@aclu.org. Have a great day.